Alice, thank you so much for having me. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today.
This is going to be fun because I was lucky enough to be a guest and interviewed by you on Spotlight Salon earlier this year. And now the tables have turned and I get to interview you. I'm really excited to dive into that.
I know, I love that. I absolutely love that. And that really, ties in with my own philosophy that when you build a relationship with someone, it's for the long term, right? So you don't
Yeah.
just have a one-stop sort of shop for visibility. It's a long-term game with relationship building. So thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Well said. And we are talking about visibility today. We checked in a little bit before we began recording, and I think you will agree that our intention for this call is to help our listeners feel brave enough and be consistent enough to become more visible.
Yes.
I think we should start by defining visibility so that we're all on the same page here. So, given your expertise in particular with the media, how would you define visibility for our listeners?
Yeah, I love this question. So thank you so much for starting with this question, Dallas. So I define visibility as the way that you tell your story, and it's very much telling your story with authenticity and purpose to connect with your audience so that you can create sales for your business and so that it ties to your business's mission and objectives. I focus visibility by linking it directly to your business objectives so that
Right.
we're telling a story with purpose.
That's so interesting because I think that for a lot of us, and I may even be in this camp, I've always just connected visibility with just put yourself out there, right?
Yeah.
Visibility is putting yourself out there and being seen by others. But what I hear you saying is it's more about the quality of the message than it is the quantity of the eyeballs who see it. Did I get that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It is
Mhm.
absolutely about the quality of the message, but it's also making sure that when you do give a strong quality message, you know exactly why you are sharing that message. What is that
Right.
message leading into? Which is why I always tie visibility and PR back to your business objectives and your goals. So that's the management consultant in me, which is saying, don't just start climbing onto a rooftop and shouting about your business. You have to
Mhm.
actually bring it back down to what you were trying to achieve with your business in the first place.
Got it. Do you have an example of that, maybe from your business right now or your business in the past, about how your business goals impacted the strategy you took with
Yes.
visibility?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Brilliant question. Absolutely brilliant question. So, in my last business, I had a fashion tech business called Star Lyrical, which I often use as a case study because I got into the media, the British media, very quickly. And fashion here in the UK is a very, very crowded market. So when you are a new business, in a crowded market, it's very difficult to stand out. I knew immediately from day one that I had to get into the British media and win over British fashion journalists because my end goal actually wasn't just to be in the media for the sake of being in the media and all the credibility that comes with that. It was to prove to an investor, a male investor, that when I pitched to them for money for my startup, that
Mm.
they would see a return on their investment. So if I was being featured in all the major media in the UK, when I went to pitch to them and I had what they have in the, Silicon Valley and here in the London startup scene, you have your pitch deck. My dream from day one was to have a slide with lots of media logos so that when
Right.
someone looked at me, particularly as a woman of color, and say, "Oh, do I want to invest in her or do I want to invest in that white guy over there, who might
Right.
feel like a safer bet, because I was very aware of
Mhm.
that unconscious bias." I knew that they would invest in me if they saw all those logos and that I, as a solopreneur, had been featured in all that media. I could show them that every pound they put into my company, they would get X amount of return back because I was making that marketing budget work even harder. So I was very, very clear. Even now I'm talking about it, I was so clear, crystal clear about why I was pitching. And that knowing that I was going to stand up in those pitch meetings was
Yeah.
exactly the motivation I needed to pitch myself to quite frankly, one of the hardest set of people I've ever pitched to. British journalists, fashion journalists.
Yeah, right.
They are harder than Goldman Sachs bankers, I'll tell you that. Very, very tough.
Right.
So to bring it back to the audience here,
Yeah.
get really crystal clear about why you want to be visible in the first place. Are you trying to grow your audience because you're launching a course? Are you trying to build credibility in your industry because it might be a little bit crowded and there's a million financial coaches out there? You know, are you selling a product which is, you know, a little bit hard to differentiate because there's lots of jewelry artists out there or lots of, you know, musicians out there? What will make you stand out? So it's really important you're clear why first. And once you know, to quote Simon Sinek, once you start with your why, it becomes really clear where you're going to go.
Right. So as I'm taking this in, if my goal is to find more members in the Hive, for example, it might matter less for me to be featured in Forbes magazine than for me to be a guest on a teeny tiny podcast with a very loyal following of coaches who want to run a values-driven business. I could actually get closer to my goal going that route than just trying to get a bunch of logos of magazines I've been featured in.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, a media feature with a logo could give you the credibility when it's on your website. But actually, if your goal is to directly bring in those Hive members, then as you say, if you think those Hive members are listening to that person's podcast or sitting in someone's mastermind, then that is exactly where you need to focus your attention.
Okay. Great. So the first step, this is for our listeners, is to really clarify what is the goal, what is my business goal right now? And from there, you can develop a visibility strategy that connects as directly as possible to that goal. I think it's also a great motivator, right? So if I'm pitching to a lot of podcasts and the goal is just like to get on a podcast, I'm not pitching. I have other things to do. I'm too nervous. No, thank you. But if my goal is to help more coaches pass the 6-figure mark, there's like more purpose there. And then it can help me move through the resistance I might be having about pitching or being more visible. This brings me to the next question. Can you talk about how a coach can cultivate more fortitude or more confidence in order to become more visible?
Yes, absolutely. So with confidence, I one of the things I teach my own students in my program, Pitch to Press, is that confident people are made. They're not born, right? There's often this false assumption that, you know, confident people, everyone's born confident and, you know, there are confident people, there are extroverts, and, you know, there's this sort of very simplistic view. And that's just incorrect, you know. So just remember, confident people are made and not born. So one of the things I teach, and this is one of my favorite affirmations I teach my students, which is journalists are not gods, right? Journalists are not gods. And what that means is that, and it's journalists, it can be journalists, it could be podcasters, it could be, you know, another entrepreneur, someone you want, an influencer. They're not gods, right? Don't put them on a pedestal thinking that they are in this power position. Like you're back at school and you're a 5-year-old and they're a teacher and you're asking for permission for everything. Whenever I teach them, I say just sweep that perception off the table, because you have to remember that journalists, podcasters, bloggers, influencers, those people need to hear your story. And without your story, their job doesn't exist, right? They need to post content. They need to put news stories out there. They need to have podcast guests on their podcasts. They need that content. And if you are not pitching and putting your story forward, then they don't have anything to share. So immediately when I work with my students, we see that sort of shift in dynamic, right? So people realize that actually they're keeping someone else in their job, you know, when they're telling their story. So if you want to reach more people and tell more people about the work that you do, then don't deny it. Like, don't hold it back. Like, keep a journalist in their job and tell that story.
Mm-hmm.
And, when I share that with people, it's like the light bulb switch goes off and they think,
Yeah, totally.
I never thought of it that way. I never thought that
Yeah.
I'm keeping someone in their job by telling my story. And suddenly,
Yeah.
the tables have turned. And there's a quirky story behind this, which is when I say you're keeping a journalist in your job, I mean it. Like, well, I used to work as a management consultant and worked at Sky Sports News. And I had to transform Sky Sports News. And I sat with journalists in a newsroom for a year. So this affirmation hasn't been, isn't plucked out from thin air. I
Mm-hmm.
saw that if a journalist didn't have a story that day to tell their boss in the Monday morning meeting, they were going to be on my spreadsheet and be canned, right? Quite literally. So I
Wow. Right.
know that this is coming from real life experience from a 24-hour newsroom. And it's a very, if you think Sky Sports News is very like Ted Lasso, if anyone watches Ted Lasso, it's a
Okay.
very footballer, bantery newsroom. And, you've got to have a story. You've got to have a story. No story, no job, basically.
No story,
So
no job.
exactly. So that's the
Yeah.
number one way of making everyone confident who's listening today is keep
Yeah.
someone in their job by telling your story.
Yeah, you're doing a service. So you've mentioned this a few times now, telling your story, and you have not mentioned once the word pitching. So can
Mm.
you illustrate for me and for our listeners, like paint this picture for us? Like, what is the distinction between telling my story and pitching?
I love that you have picked up on that, right?
Mhm.
Dallas, because I see pitching as telling your story. I
Okay.
don't I don't even like the word pitching because I think it scares people. It really scares
Mhm.
people because they think, oh, I have to nail this pitch, and it becomes something on their to-do list. If you're able to tell your story and tell it eloquently and confidently, you're not pitching. You're having a conversation with someone, right?
Mhm.
Someone might be looking and thinking, hang on, they're pitching. But actually, the person listening is saying, oh, she's telling me about her work. And I'd really like to work with that person, or I'd really like that
Mhm.
person on my podcast. And so, you know, you get invited to something and then you walk away and think, actually, I think I just pitched, but I didn't realize I was pitching. I was telling my story. So let
Right.
me give you an example of this, Dallas. I was at my yoga class 2 days ago. You'll love this story. 48 hours ago, I was in a yoga class. Actually,
Okay.
today's Wednesday. So on Sunday, I was in a yoga class. And a lady came up to me at the end of the class when we have chai and samosas, and it's a very brilliant class. And she said, "Oh, what do you do?" And I thought, "Oh, I've just done a 2-hour class. I don't want to talk about what I do."
Right. You're like, actually, what
But
I do is drink chai. That's what I
and what I
do
want
right
to
now.
do, I've just come on the back of a very intense virtual summit. I'm here to unwind and not talk about any more visibility. But I did tell her, I did talk to her, and she said, how funny. You know what? I'm actually a publicist myself. I'm a PR person. But you know what? The hardest thing and she did the PR for Nando's. I mean, she wasn't, just, she was a very highly skilled publicist. And she said, but you know what? The hardest thing is to do it for yourself. I'd love
Mm.
to find out more. Can we connect? Can we have a call? And I said, well, funny that. I'm just about to issue out a link for some discovery calls, and
Right.
I tried to have a holiday on Monday, and then she emailed me and chased me for it. So I sent her the link. But honestly, I was not pitching at the point. I was just telling my story. Just telling
Yes.
my story. So that's an
Yeah.
example. When you tell your story, you're not pitching. So I can tell you the
Mm.
anatomy of a pitch. That's not a problem. But I want people to walk away with, tell your story.
Yeah. I love that you've eliminated the word pitch because I think it accesses a different part of our brain than telling a story. So I looked at a client's um, webinar. I call it an invitation in the webinar. So
Yes.
yesterday she had a webinar. She has a webinar coming up, and she wanted to perform the pitch basically for me. And I had notes. I had 3 pages of notes, but they all said the same thing over and over again, which was, I'm not seeing any emotion, and you're not telling me any stories. It was
Yes.
really just, here are the details of the course that I'm giving you. Here are the bonuses. Here is the price, and here's the discount. It was like, it was very pitchy, right? And it's because she was
Yes.
relating to this as the pitch. And for values driven coaches, we don't like getting pitched at. We don't like pitching. That word doesn't work. But if it's defined that way, it's almost like we don't have permission to tell the story. So I love that
Yes.
you're making that distinction, because it is really the difference. I think, tell me what your thoughts are, but it's the difference first in making that effective connection, but secondly, in being consistent. Because if
Yes.
I'm pitching and I hate it, I'm not going to do it very often.
Well, exactly. And it's
Mm,
actually rolling back from that and, going back into the word trust, right? People
yeah.
will only connect with people they trust. And we have to remember, whenever we are actually pitching or, slash
Mhm.
telling our story, people buy from people, right? So whatever you have on your presentation slides, the words, the data, they do have to line up, and the content, has to make sense. But
Yes.
fundamentally, it's you standing there, a sort of straight line of energy, talking about something you're passionate about. And people can tell,
Mhm.
we, judge you within 7 seconds and work out if
Mhm.
you're truly passionate about your subject or not. So if
Yeah.
you're not establishing that connection with someone, if you're not
Mhm.
establishing that trust within those first 7 seconds, you've lost it. Basically,
You've lost
it's
it.
not a, you've lost it. It's not going to happen for you.
Yeah. Let's talk about other mistakes. So we've highlighted this easy mistake that most of us make, which is just relating to pitching as pitching instead of storytelling. Can you
Yes.
highlight a few other mistakes that you see entrepreneurs and coaches making often, and then maybe even offer up some solutions?
Yes, of course. So
Cool.
the first mistake I think a lot of entrepreneurs make is that they don't even start the journey
Mm,
of
yeah.
getting visible and putting themselves forwards for opportunities, right? So they often say, "Oh, I'm not ready for PR. I'm not ready to get visible. My business isn't perfect yet. Oh, I have to get my website, all the copy has to be perfect on my website." And they don't start with being visible. And the danger is that if they don't start with being visible, what ends up happening is that they get to the cliff edge where they don't have a healthy pipeline of clients. They don't have a growing pool, of an audience. And so they then start scrambling around saying, "Oh, my coach has told me I need to get visible." And they start trying to get visible. But you have to remember that it takes at least 6 to 12 months to build a relationship with someone. So
Yeah.
if you haven't started from day one, building that relationship and getting visible with people, by the time it comes to that scramble when you're on the cliff edge looking for clients, it's going to be really difficult to start getting collaborations in the diary because you've not allowed time for those relationships to
Mm,
flourish with other entrepreneurs. So I
mhm.
always say to people, start before you feel ready. Start the minute you start your business, connecting with people, networking with people, collaborating with people, because you're all going to be on a journey together and you're all going to watch each other grow at the same time. And therefore, you know, by the time you start talking, reaching out to people, say, "Hey, I want to be on your podcast, Alice. We've known
Yeah.
each other for 8 months." And you're like, "Hey, why not? Yeah, okay, you
Yeah.
can come on the podcast," because we've allowed that relationship to flourish. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
It really does. So the mistake I'm hearing you say is people don't start early enough. They think the time to start is when they need a result. And what you're saying is it takes 6 months or more for that result, for that seed that you plant to
Yes.
actually blossom. That's
Yes.
really great. Yeah.
Yes. So that's mistake number one. And then
Hmm.
another typical mistake that people make is once they do start getting confident with visibility and they do start pitching for opportunities and telling their story to people, they don't necessarily personalize their pitches. So they lift
Right.
some swipe copy that they've seen, on the internet, download it as a lead magnet somewhere, and they're not personalizing any of those pitches so that the reader on the other end who receives that pitch thinks, Nah, they've pitched to 50 people with that pitch. There's nothing personal here. And some of the mistakes people make are quite simply shocking. Like I interviewed a journalist, about 6 weeks ago who used to write for the Wall Street Journal, and people are calling her, Mr. instead of Miss.
That
They
happens
don't
to me
know.
all the time. All the
They
time
just
that happens to me.
You just get. I mean, I once had 200 pictures in my inbox once, like 2 years ago. And honestly, people just not acknowledging who you are and what you do and what your work has been.
Mm-hmm.
You just feel so used, and you just don't want to. I don't know about you, but I just don't want to reply to those emails. So not
Mm-hmm.
personalizing your pitches is number 2, right?
Yeah.
That people do. And then thirdly, just using swipe copy.
Yeah.
And that leads to those impersonal pitches. They're the
Yeah.
3 sort of classic mistakes I see people make.
Yeah. I feel like I'm about to throw someone under the bus here, but because we have a podcast, we get pitches often from like third parties. So a podcast pitching agency or publicist.
Yes.
And I so want to email the person they're pitching directly and tell them, please stop spending money on this service, because first of all, they're calling me Mr. Travers. So I'm not a Travers and I'm not a Mr., right? And it literally is cut and paste. And I can tell very much that they have this strategy of volume. If I send enough of these out, we will get a bite. And that does not a relationship make. So that's what I hear you saying here is relying and outsourcing this, which is why I think it's so brilliant that this is something you teach coaches to do. Because outsourcing it doesn't allow for that same level of personal connection. And it basically guarantees that they're going to be using cut and paste swipe copy and not personalizing it.
Yeah, exactly. And the danger is when you start outsourcing people to pitch for you who aren't brilliant at what they do. So,
right. Maybe there is a time and a place to have a PR team, but there's a difference between that and hiring someone who's going to pitch for you. Go ahead.
Yes. But if they are not good at pitching for you and they're doing a poor job, the problem is that is associated with your name, with your personal brand, because you're going to read that email and say, oh, so and so, that money coach over there, oh dear, that's not a great pitch, because their name is featured in the email. So they're aligning their brand immediately, their personal brand, with poor quality pitching, poor quality emails. And the industry is small, so immediately you're I would say don't pitch, right? It's better to not pitch than put a poor quality pitch out there that's completely impersonal, that people view as spam, because nobody likes spammers, and that's what it can end up looking like, spam.
That's what it can feel like.
Yes, and you don't want to associate your brand with that. But the beauty of this is that it's not difficult to learn how to write good, strong pitches. It really isn't. I get a 90% success rate in my pitches. I've had some phenomenal famous people reply to my pitches. And it always comes down to some very simple principles that people can learn quite easily. The trick for people here is to practice it and take the action, which is where a lot of people struggle with. But there are ways to get over that.
Okay, so now you got to spill the tea here, Adela. You said a 90% success rate. So is there even just one golden nugget that you could teach today to help our listeners start telling their story more, pitching, right? And avoid just falling into that black hole and never getting responses?
Yes, of course. So number 1 is to personalize your pitches. Absolutely personalize your pitches so that the reader on the other end feels seen and acknowledged. So the way you personalize your pitch is to have something very unique to that individual in the pitch. And some people, some people put the personalization in the PS. I don't do that. I hit someone in the personalization at the very first paragraph. Yeah. So if I was to pitch to you, I'd say, hey, Dallas, I absolutely loved listening to the last episode of, Coaches on a Mission, where you interviewed this person, you talked about X, Y, Z. But I noticed that you guys didn't talk about ABC. And actually, I can talk about ABC. I'd be very interested to come in and speak to you on those topics, because I think your audience may get a lot of value from that. So you kind of roll with that, right? So first of all, you're showing, Dallas here, that you're acknowledging her audience. But a good thing is to actually reference something you've listened to and why you loved it in the first place. So when you reference something, your work, Dallas, if someone references your work, you feel seen, right? You put a lot of effort into your podcast. You feel seen. Yeah.
Completely.
So this is exactly it. If someone references your work and you feel seen, so powerful. So powerful.
Yeah.
And that's how
By the way,
you
listeners,
nail a
this is
pitch.
exactly what Adela did to get on the show. So it works because we are here talking about this, but she sent me Adela, you sent me an Instagram DM and you said, I just listened to this episode and here's what was so great about it. And I loved the conversation about XYZ. And I noticed you didn't talk about ABC and I'd love to come in and talk about it. Almost verbatim. That's what you did. So great.
Yes. Yeah. And it's so powerful, right? And, anyone who creates content, the biggest compliment you can give them, whatever that content is, whether it's a news article, whether it's a podcast, whether it's, a post on Instagram or an email newsletter, they just want someone to read it or listen to it or hear it.
Yeah.
There's no, we produce content all the time. If someone emails you back and says, hey, I really loved what you did and this is why I loved it, wow, that makes that person's day. It really does. Because it can feel like you're on a hamster wheel of content creation. So never underestimate the simplicity of this. It's not. It's very powerful.
I want to highlight something, and I'd love your thoughts, but I feel that the more specific you are in your personalization, the better.
Yes.
So I had someone once who pitched to me, and the thing that she said, it was just so funny, but what it told me was that she's been watching and paying attention. She talked about my earrings and how like anytime she sees me, I've always got like a really cool pair of earrings on. And in particular, that gold pair with the brass dangle, like she described a pair of earrings. And I really, because I clearly put thought into my earrings because I like, that's a thing for me, evidently. And I felt even as much I felt seen by that observation as I did when people compliment a specific part of a podcast episode. So I think the point I'm making here is number one, specificity. And perhaps, and what are your thoughts on this? Like, perhaps there is an opportunity when it resonates to acknowledge something outside of their work and more about like how they show up as a human. What do you think?
I love that. And it's something I do a lot as well. It's that, can you get very personal in the PS that in a way that feels really comfortable to you?
Cool.
One of the things I did, I think it was actually in your round of the Spotlight Salon when you were featured on it, Dallas, there was one speaker who loves cats. She's like, if you go onto her Instagram, she's an incredible individual and she just has stories of her like cats all the time. And actually, interesting enough with her, I didn't lead with the technical part of the pitch and say, hey, you talk about this. I'd love to invite you. I just said, you know what? I really love your cat. And I have this breed of cat. And have you ever been to a cat cafe? And I just went very quirky with that introduction because I just knew that would resonate with her. I could tell.
Yeah, that's so great.
You have to, the whole point of this is you really have to understand who you're pitching to and how they talk about their work, who they are as a human, if they're sharing that side of their business, and personalize your pitch in a way that you think will land. But the key thing is, if you want to do a very quick spot check on your pitch, one of the things I teach my students is when you're reviewing your pitch, just look at the number of I's versus you's in your pitch. So are you using the word you or your more often than I? And if you're saying, hey, Dallas, I loved your earrings, I listened to your podcast, I loved your episode, there's more yous in that, those sentences, right? Whereas if I just said, hey, I'm Adela, I like to climb mountains and drink hot chocolate, and I talk about visibility, there's a lot of I's in those sentences. So there's a very quick, simple check on your pitch, which is...
that's such a great golden tool there. That's awesome.
That's your nugget there for
Yous
so versus great. I's. Count the number of yous versus I's. That's how you do it.
Wow. So let me start this sentence with you. You, Adela, have brought so much wisdom and insight and experience to this conversation. I see inside of the Hive often, this is an area where coaches can psych themselves out. And what you've delivered today is so helpful to help normalize the pitching process, because it's really just about creating connection. And that's what coaches do really well. So I thank you so sincerely for coming on the show today. This was awesome.
Oh, you're welcome, Dallas. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So listeners, make sure. So I want you to do two things. Number one, check the show notes so that you can connect with Adela and learn more from her. And then number two, challenge yourself before the week is through to tell your story, whether that's DMing someone, whether that's pitching yourself to a show, whether that's following up with someone you had a discovery session with who didn't end up hiring you. Can you tell your story in a concrete way today in order to move closer to your business goals? So with that, Adela, thank you again for being on the show, and I will see you all back here next week. Bye-bye.